So here we are in Genesis chapter 9. The flood just took place, chapter 8, and Noah and his family come out of the ark. In chapter 8, verse 20, then Noah praises God. He builds an altar to the Lord and took every clean animal and every clean bird and offered a burnt offering to the Lord as a wonderful, sweet smelling aroma to the Lord. And the Lord said in his heart, verse 21 of chapter 8, I will never again curse the ground for man's sake, although the imagination of man's heart is so evil from his youth. I will again destroy never any living thing as I have done here. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, day and night shall never cease. Chapter 9. So God, the continuation of the covenant here, as a sacrifice is given by Noah to the Lord, so God blessed Noah. Recall, the Mosaic covenant is about sacrifices to the Lord, but also recall chapter 4, there were offerings and sacrifices to the Lord by Cain and Abel. And there are now sacrifices in chapter 8, moving into chapter 9, by Noah. There was an altar built moving forward in chapter 12 in the life of Abraham as well. And there are sacrifices and altars given to the Lord throughout. It's not just a Mosaic covenant thing. There's a continuity of us praising God and building an altar to the Lord, as we'll see that throughout the whole book of Genesis leading up to the life of Moses and the Mosaic covenant. So a sacrifice is given as a burnt offering, as a sweet-smelling aroma to the Lord. And God blessed Noah, chapter 9, verse 1. God blessed Noah and his sons and said, "Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth." Very reminiscent of Genesis chapter 2. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, just as Adam and Eve were supposed to do. Sort of a recreation now. Creation number 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and he wanted mankind to be fruitful and multiply. Now, after the flood, a restatement of this: be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. God's grace would be with Noah and his family. In this covenantal relationship with Noah, we're going to note a few things, particularly verses 1 through 7, the things that Noah must do in this covenantal relationship as he builds an altar and makes a sacrifice to the Lord, an offering, a sweet-smelling offering to the Lord. There are certain things that Noah now will be required to do. There will be some restrictions. There will be a different relationship now with he and God and he and the earth because of this flood. Verses 2 through 7. Now, in this new covenant relationship, God says, "The fear of you and the dread of you shall be on every beast of the earth, on every bird of the air, on all that moves on the earth, and all the fish of the sea. They are given into your hand. Every moving thing on the earth will be fearful of mankind." There is now, because of sin, the result of sin, and there's hundreds of years that transpire now from the Genesis chapter 3 and the fall to here, and we see when God says clearly that if you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will surely die. And certainly there wasn't an immediate death, but there was this ongoing, slow but sure death that takes place. One of the results of sin that we see here now in chapter 9 is that there's a break in the relationship between man and animal. There's a difference now in relationship. God, through his grace, protected man and animal having relationship together, as Adam in chapter 2 certainly had dominion over the animal world. There was a naming of the animals, and there was in some measure good relationship with animals. But since the fall of chapter 3, and certainly now moving into chapter 9, we see a demarcation here, a very strong changing of the guards, as it were, to now where animal and man don't have that same kind of relationship. God, through his grace, allowed people like Abel and Jabal in chapter 4 to be able to be farmers and to be herdsmen and to have flocks. Certainly the people of Egypt had flocks in chapter 12 moving forward. There certainly people had flocks and were shepherds prior to chapter 9. But there is now a strong difference in how man will deal with animals. There will be a disruption between mankind and the animal world. God, by his grace, allowed Noah to get the animals into the ark, and there was obviously a very good relationship for 150 days of Noah and the animals on the ark, as God graciously allowed the animals on the ark with mankind. But now, as the animals disembark the ark, there is a very strong difference in relationship. Not only is there a strong difference in relationship, and there's a fear now relationship with man and animal. Verse 3, every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. I've given you all things, even as the green herbs. Not only has creation changed their dietary restrictions from just green herbs and the grass of the field, they are now going to be eating the creatures, the fish, and the birds of the air. We're not sure if before this time they were only or strictly vegetarians. Again, chapter 4, as they have herds, as Abel and his family have herds and sheep, we would think that they probably use those for food as well. But there isn't a lot that's being said about that. Here in this covenant with Noah, we see a very strong, now overt command that every moving thing can be food for you. Not only is there a change in relationship with the animals in terms of dominion and fear that animals have of humans, probably rightfully so because of sin, there is now animals being used for food. One of the reasons why animals may be used for food, why God maybe more overtly states this, is simply because the earth has been destroyed. There's no food. Any food that they have was on the ark. And moving forward, if they were to plant, which we know in chapter 9, verse 18 and following, he plants a vineyard, and certainly he grows grapes and makes wine. But certainly it's going to take a while for the earth to be repopulated in terms of its herbs and green pastures and plants and such. So I'm sure there was a element of grace by God to allow for animals to be killed for food. Nonetheless, if there are animals for food, verse 4 says, you shall not eat flesh that is alive, that still has life. Worded two ways in verse 4, kill only for food, not for sports. Yes, God's covenant, God's command, his responsibilities is that you should take care of the animals, but know that the animals will fear you, and there's a changing of relationship with the animals. Speaking of the animals, you will eat animals for food, but only for food. You will not kill animals for sport, because life is in the blood. Speaking of the blood, verse 5, surely for your lifeblood I will demand a reckoning. From the hand of every beast I will require it. From the hand of every man's brother I will require the life of a man. So, in other words, there is recourse for murder. Since we cannot eat flesh with living, that is life, that is in the blood, surely if one kills something or someone that is alive, a reckoning will take place. This isn't necessarily capital punishment. We see maybe the start, the birthplace of it. This isn't necessarily political capital punishment. It's just saying God is making a very strong statement that says, life is mine. Verse 6, whoever sheds man's blood, by man's blood will be shed, for he is the image of God. He's made a man in the image of God. So don't kill, be fruitful and multiply. The point isn't necessarily every time someone kills someone, you must put them to death. It's a principle that God gives that says, I honor life. Remember, verse 7, As for you, be fruitful and multiply. I don't want you to shed man's blood. I want you to be fruitful. He said it in verse 1, be fruitful and multiply. Now he says it in verse 7, be fruitful, and inclusio to these first 7 verses. Be fruitful, multiply. Don't kill. If you're going to kill, kill for food. And I'm giving you that grace to kill only for food when necessary. Other than that, do not kill. Do not kill. And he makes these, he's not setting a political capital punishment law here. He's just saying that one should not kill for sport, and one shouldn't kill out of anger. One shouldn't kill for any reason. If there is, there's going to be a reckoning that takes place, because all sin has a reaction. All sin will have recourse. The sin of killing one will be the death of another. I will require it. God certainly doesn't believe that for everyone who kills someone, someone should be killed, as he offered grace to Cain. Cain kills his brother Abel, and God shows immense grace. God has shown such immense grace to so many people, even already up to chapter 9, even with the flood. God sees how people kill one another, and God says, you are made in my image, and I want you to be fruitful and multiply and not kill. This is not a license to go around killing those who have killed others. This is not a license for capital punishment. This is a principle that God gives that says, because of sin and because now of a recreation after the flood, there's going to be a difference in relationship with animals. There's going to be a difference in relationship to your diet. There's going to be a difference in killing now for food, not just eating plants. And there is a recourse for all murder, because man is made in the image of God. I don't want you to murder. I don't want there to be a recourse for murder, because you are made in the image of God. I want you to be fruitful and multiply. Life has changed drastically. Chapter 9, verses 1 through 7 is so different than the previous 6 chapters leading up to the flood. There is a cataclysmic difference in relationship with man and animal, and man and his creation. Not only is there a difference of what man now must do and what is required to do and how he thinks, but now verses 8 through 17, there is stipulations on what God will do in his covenant. So God spoke to Noah and his sons, saying this, and as for me, behold, I will establish my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature. It's a covenant not just with Noah and his family, but with every living creature, the birds, the cattle, the beasts of the earth. So all the things that went out of the ark, I am establishing my covenant with you. Verse 11, the word established again, just like in verse 9. I will thusly establish my covenant with you. Never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. God said, this is the sign of my covenant which I make between you. I am not just telling you, God says, that I'm establishing my covenant, that I will not destroy anything by water again. He said, I'm going to have a sign of this covenant that I am making between me and you and every creature that is with you for a perpetual generation. See, I set my bow, my rainbow in the cloud. Whether or not this is a rainbow for the first time or a rainbow has been there because there's been water and there's been ways in which God has watered the earth. There may have been rainbows before, but now the rainbow will be a sign between the earth and God, that verse 14, it shall be that when I bring a cloud over the earth, that the rainbow shall be seen in the cloud, and I will remember my covenant, which is between me and you, and every living creature of the flesh. The water shall never become a flood to destroy all flesh. The rainbow shall be in a cloud, and I will look on it and remember the everlasting covenant between the flesh and all that is on the earth. And God said to Noah, this is the sign of the covenant which I have established between me and the flesh that is on the earth. So, chapter 9, verses 1 through 7 is what man must do in this new covenant relationship. A difference in relationship with the animal world, a difference in relationship to his dietary needs, a difference in relationship to killing for food, certainly not for sport, and some recourse for murder and death, but the whole purpose of grace, of being fruitful and multiplying. Murder is not an option in God's economy. In verses 8 through 17, though, God puts it now on himself. This is my covenant. This is not your covenant. This is a covenant that I'm establishing with you. This is my covenant, and I'm making it with every living creature. I'm establishing my covenant with you. And this is the sign of my covenant. This is the sign of my promise to you that there will be no more flood waters to destroy the entire earth. The sign that I make and that I bring to you is a perpetual sign to all generations. See the rainbow in the sky? When I look, isn't it interesting in verse 15? When I look at the bow, when I look at the rainbow, I will remember my covenant. So when we look at the rainbow, we just don't see God's grace. We should see God in action. When I look at the rainbow in the sky, I know that God sees it and God is remembering his covenant. Not only can I remember God's covenant with the rainbow, God remembers his covenant. Every time I see a rainbow, I think, wow, God's looking at the same thing and looking at it and recalling and remembering. So God is such a faithful God. Every time there's a rainbow, I look at it and I say, wow, right now in this moment, God is remembering his covenant. The rainbow will be in the cloud, and I will look on it, and I will remember my everlasting covenant. Verse 16. I will remember my everlasting covenant, and I will not destroy the earth. Boy, that sounds familiar. It sounds like the Mosaic covenant. As the blood is being put on the doorpost, God remembers the covenant. He sees the blood on the doorpost, and he passes by. The angel of death passes by, and he preserves life. Now, the rainbow is sort of a blood on the doorpost foreshadow. I will see the rainbow in the sky, the rainbow over the doorpost, as it were, the rainbow over the sky, and I will shed man's blood no more by water. This is the sign of my covenant that I am establishing between me and all flesh on the earth. What an amazing covenant. Man is going to have a different dietary restriction. Man must not kill for any reason, but only for food. There's a difference in the change of relationship with man and animal, but there's the same relationship that he has with God. God, in an everlasting way, makes an everlasting covenant with Noah moving forward that he will dispense his grace to mankind. Established, used so many times in this passage. Verse 9, I will establish my covenant with you. Verse 11, I will establish my covenant with you. Verse 16, I will look and establish my covenant. Verse 17, this is the sign of my covenant that I have established between you and me. God is establishing his character within the covenant community. The wonderful sign of the rainbow shows his faithfulness to mankind and his creation. The rainbow in the cloud, much like the blood on the doorpost, a remembrance of God and his grace. The rainbow is a wonderful sign that God remembers his covenant, that God will dispense his grace and his faithfulness to mankind. So while there is judgment, chapter 6 through 8, there's judgment of sin that takes place. God dispenses his grace in this wonderful covenant as Noah builds an ark, places animals on the ark, and he calls it a burnt offering. Nonetheless, a burnt offering, a sweet-smelling aroma to the Lord. Yes, there will be a difference in relationship with mankind and his creation. There's going to be different dietary needs. There's going to be a different way of life for Noah and the children moving forward. But God's grace is still there to be fruitful and to multiply, and God's established covenant would be with him, that he will remember the sign of his covenant, that he will be with us forever. So even though there's sin, there's hope. God judges sin, yet he's merciful, loving, and patient. Notice the similarities here between the Noahic covenant, as it were, right? The Noahic covenant in chapter 8, verse 20, all the way through 9:18. There's God's act of deliverance. God's act of deliverance from the flood and the ark. And in the Mosaic covenant, God's act of deliverance, getting them out of Egypt into the promised land. And then, of course, building an altar to the Lord, both in the Noahic altar here and the Mosaic covenant of building an altar with the priesthood. The altar and its offering are critical parts of every covenant, as we see here in the Noahic covenant and also in the Mosaic covenant. The burnt offering is even used in chapter 8, verse 20 and 21, just like the burnt offering said in the end of Exodus into Leviticus chapter 1. An altar and an offering are critical parts of the covenant as we give our best to the Lord, as we bless him. There's God's blessing for obeying. There's God's blessing of promise. There's God's blessing for obeying, to be fruitful and to multiply and to have good relationship with God. There's promise. There'll be protection from both animals and humans. Exodus 23 particularly talks about the protection that God's people will have from the animals and also from humans, those who would obey his covenant in Exodus chapter 24. God promises that the earth will be kept from destruction once again, and there will be a visible sign in the clouds. We know that the visible sign in the cloud here is the rainbow, and in Exodus 24, we know that there's going to be a visible sign of God's character, of God's glory, the cloud that will go with them by day and the pillar of fire by night. Yes, God's covenant at Mount Sinai in Exodus and into Leviticus is not necessarily an entirely new one per se. In many ways, it's a restatement, or at least a more detailed account, of God's covenant of bestowing blessings and faithfulness and purity for God's people moving forward. So we see a continuity, I guess is really what I'm trying to say. There's a continuity between the covenants. It isn't just an Adamic covenant that's so different than Noahic covenant, that's so different than Mosaic covenant. We see a continuity of the faithfulness of God. Yes, there are things that mankind must do, but there are things that God will always do. And it is so parallel. All these covenants have so much in common. God's act of deliverance, an altar, an offering, and certainly in Romans chapter 12, we are a sweet-smelling aroma to the Lord, and we are living sacrifices to the Lord. In Revelation, it talks about that the prayers of the saints are a sweet-smelling aroma to the Lord. Our covenant promises, the covenant people of God, are sweet-smelling aroma. We are living sacrifices of God's covenant. There is blessing and promise for obeying God's covenant, and there is certainly blessing and the promise for us for obeying God's covenant of grace today. God will protect us, God will keep us, and God will ensure that there is eternal life waiting for us someday in his covenantal promise. There will be always a visible sign of God's glory on this earth. Certainly we live by faith and not by sight, but we see signs every day that God is who he is, and a visible sign today, whether it be the rainbow or the clouds in the sky, that God is an amazing creator God who loves us with an everlasting love, a sign of his faithfulness. And don't forget, it's not just a sign for me. The sign of the rainbow is for God. Verse 15 of chapter 9, I will remember my covenant between. Every time you see this, remember what I am seeing. When you look at the rainbow, wow, God is watching that. God is seeing that. Wow, God is so faithful. So while we see judgment for sure based on sin, and we will see it moving forward, there will always be judgment for sin, and there will come a time, according to Revelation, there will be a final judgment where God finally makes all things new and we live then by sight and no longer by faith. Until then, God will have signs of his covenant throughout all generations, one being like this rainbow, that we can remember his covenant and we can see that God will always remember his covenant. As God sees the rainbow in the cloud, he looks on it and remembers his everlasting covenant, just like the Passover blood at the doorpost, as he passes by, giving grace to all with the blood on the doorposts. So chapter 9, verses 1 through 17, a wonderful small truncation of God's covenant, yes, albeit with some change because of sin, God's faithfulness to his people, God's protection, God's act of grace, and a newness in the relationship with mankind and with the animal world. God is faithful to his covenant. He not only gives stipulations for mankind to follow, he gives his own stipulations for himself. He will establish, he will remember, he will be faithful, he will see a sign. He will look on it, he will remember his faithfulness. God is a faithful God.
You've been listening to the chapter and verse teaching of pastor, author, and Bible teacher Wayne Kinde. We trust that these messages are enriching your life and assisting you in your walk with the Lord. You can help us further our efforts to make these messages available by donating at waynekinde.com/donate.